We're just going to get started in 1 minute. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm Amy Ginden, the Social Justice Committee Chair at Temple Sinai of Sharon. I, along with my committee members, the Sharon Racial Equity Alliance, and Sustainable Sharon Coalition, have co-sponsored this event tonight because this is a deeply important issue that is and has been affecting the health and safety of people of color for far too long. Our goal for this conversation tonight is for you to learn a little more about environmental justice, why it's so important, get a chance to ask your own questions, and find out specific steps you can take to push for positive change. I'd like to introduce you to 4 panelists here with us tonight who are experts in the field. First, we have Kiana Pierre-Louis, a senior law lecturer at Bentley University. Kiana teaches a number of business law courses and courses on diversity and inclusion, like race in the law and social justice law. She's also a founder of the Sharon Racial Equity Alliance. Also with us is Eduardo Cicada. Eduardo is an associate professor of environment and public health at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and much of his research has been focused on environmental influences on human health and immigrant health and safety. Also here is Gary Adamkiewicz. Gary is an assistant professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, and he focuses his research on environmental health and exposure disparities. Last but certainly not least is Mark Dian. Mark is the head of state legislation at 350 Mass for a Better Future, which is an advocacy organization building a powerful statewide social movement to confront the climate crisis. Our moderator tonight is Miriam Wasser. Miriam is an environmental reporter for WBUR's environmental desk Earthwhile. Her work has also appeared in Boston Magazine, The Atlantic, Narratively, Dig Boston, and The Big Round Table. Thank you all for being here tonight. A little housekeeping before we dive in. The last 20 minutes of the event will be dedicated to your questions. So if you're watching via Zoom, you can type your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen at any time. And if you're watching via Facebook Live, you can type your question into the comment section. So I think we are ready to begin. Miriam, I will pass it over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Amy. So right now in October 2020, we are seeing the impacts of climate change all around us, from the fires out west to hurricanes in the Gulf to sea level rise just right here in Boston. But these impacts aren't felt evenly by everyone. Certain groups of people are hit harder, and they're hit hard again and again. And as a lot of us have probably seen in the news, these tend to be the same people who have been most impacted by the pandemic. So as Amy mentioned, the goal of tonight is to help you make some connections between climate change, public health, and racism, all of which intersect under the umbrella of what we might broadly call environmental justice. So the first thing I want to do is have our panelists go around and briefly tell me what environmental justice means to you and how it relates to the work that you do. So Kiana, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Miriam. So I'm going to do twofold, and I think they know me. I'm always giving an extra. So I'm going to start with racism, environmental racism, and what that means to me, and then lead to environmental justice. So environmental racism, I think we all kind of define it similarly, is kind of the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards or environmental health burdens on people of color. And that usually is from the systems, it's from the policies and practices of, largely in the United States. So environmental justice for me is that movement that responds to environmental racism. It is really trying to combat the disproportionate health hazards to people of color. And in my work, I like to say that it is a social justice issue, a civil rights issue, because like you already said, it really impacts people of color disproportionately. And you can see that right now with the pandemic.
Absolutely. All right. Eduardo.
So to me, adding to what was already said, it is environmental justice in the workplace. Environmental justice for me is related to the definition of environment as a place where you work, go to school, play, pray, and live. So I particularly focus on workplace injustice, which is part of one of the components of environmental justice, because most of us spend a lot of time in the workplace, and there are quite a few injustices that happen with workers in the workplace. In my case, I have dedicated the last almost a couple of decades on the injustice that happened with immigrants as workers in the different parts of our economy. And I have seen that environmental justice also happens in the workplace and plays a major role in the health and safety of people while they are at work and while they go home.
Great. And I'm just going to go in the order of how you appear on my screen. So Mark, you are next.
So I come at this from both some history and working on energy efficiency and renewable energy, and a policy focus on what can be done about it. And I'd say environmental justice is the recognition that we have created a storm in the climate, both physical storm and a storm of pollution. We all face the same storm, but we are not all in the same boat. And so the impacts of that storm are different depending on whether your boat is anchored to the bottom, or whether you're standing on the dock, or whether you're in a yacht. Environmental justice, from my perspective, is the recognition that this is true and the need to do something to make sure that those most vulnerable to this storm are not damaged while we try to deal with the storm itself.
A great metaphor, and I might steal that for future stories. So
I stole it from somebody else, so you're perfectly free to steal it.
And last but not least, Gary.
Thanks, Miriam. So when I think about environmental justice, for me, it's really just coming down to principles of fairness. How do you apply fairness to the lens of looking at the environmental risks that we all face? I do work on housing and community level exposures. And so how do we make the world a more fair place? We know we live in a complicated world where there are certain risks associated with modern life. And how do we make sure that those benefits are spread evenly and fairly, and also the risks are spread evenly and fairly?
Great. Okay, so now we're going to go deeper into what a lot of you had just said. And Tiana, I'm going to start with you again. So you just talked about how environmental justice is a civil rights issue. And I'd love for you to tell us more about that. And I think it might be helpful too if you gave us examples of some specific laws that perpetuate environmental racism.
Absolutely. So before I do that too, I just kind of give you a couple of stats, and I promise I'll try not to go long, but a couple of stats, because this is rich in the history of our legal policies and our governmental policies. So a couple of stats I just kind of want to leave you with, because this has been researched extensively. So a report actually reviewed data collected kind of over a 20-year period and found that more than half the people living in a 1.86 mile radius of toxic waste facilities were people of color. In the 80s, they also did another report. A study found that Black people made up the majority of communities near landfills. In 1987, a commission on racial justice found that race was the strongest variable in predicting whether the location of waste facilities will go into there. Not, you know, although economic status had to do in it, race was the strongest variable in doing that. And then lastly, I will just say in 2016, a study was published in Environmental Research Letters that basically found there was a consistent pattern over a 30-year period of placing hazardous waste facilities in neighborhoods where poor people and people of color live. So to go into the laws, you know, some people always ask me, you know, what is the major law that goes into this? What does it? And it's not that. It's kind of really systemic racism. It's kind of the foundation of the United States. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but that's exactly what it is. And Mark, what you just said was beautiful, but it's really where the starting point was. So, you know, and I'm going to do this brief because I know everybody has to go, but really if we look at segregation in this law, that lasted for almost a 70-year period. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, all the way up to, people think it's Brown, but Brown only dealt with, which was in 1954, Brown only really dealt with segregation in schools. Really segregation, full segregation and accommodations didn't really get dismantled until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That is almost a 70-year period where segregation was happening, this notion of separate but equal. But we know through the history, it was never equal. And segregation led to redlining, this wealth gap. You know, we had the Jim Crow laws, we have, you know, what happened when everybody came back from the war, GIs got their bills. During that time, the suburbs were being created, a lot of where some of us are sitting today. And the government, not individuals, the government backed $120 billion of government subsidies for people to get their houses. 98% of that went to whites. 2%, or almost less than 2%, went to families of color. So that meant when we are creating this housing system, right, a lot of people of color couldn't get into it because they didn't get that backing from the government. This is not about working hard. This is about, I didn't get that subsidy from the government. And that created this huge wealth gap. So now we're sitting today where whites really have almost 10 times the wealth of blacks. And it's when we talk about medium, the family medium net worth is $171,000 for whites and $17,150 for blacks. So that kind of calamity, and I can go on and really dig deeper, but I won't because it's a panel. But that right there kind of allowed, you know, where I think Gary and Eduardo will talk about where people of color live, where, you know, a lot of this hazardous waste is going. That really started it with segregation and our housing laws and things like that. So
yeah, one thing I would love for you to just define, maybe for anyone in the audience who doesn't know what this is, but what is redlining? You mentioned that, and in what ways does that connect to environmental injustice?
I love to. Miriam, this gets me excited, so just cut me off if you, if you need to. So redlining, and I wish I always show this little map, and it literally was a map. So in the 30s, in 1934, President Roosevelt founded the Federal Housing Administration. And it was a program that kind of, that had projects in the private sector, which was a little weird because that didn't really happen with the federal government. Anyway, it backed private housing in the private sector. During that also time, the NHS, the National Appraisal System was also created. And the National Appraisal System, with the help of the census and the help of the Federal Housing Administration, would go around and kind of survey the United States, survey neighborhoods in the United States, and they would put color codes on them. And this color code mapping system went to the banks, and it was kind of guidance on where the banks should give mortgages. So redlining was the red areas, but there was green, there was blue, and that basically stated what risk was. So green was great, green light, go ahead. Red was high risk flag. And they found out that this system wasn't just, and yes, crime and poverty had to do a little bit with it, but the biggest reason why any neighborhood got redlined was race. So largely neighborhoods of color were put in the red line. And if that's going into guidance for who is going to get a mortgage or not. Neighborhoods that were red never were able to get those mortgages or never able to basically gain any wealth in their house.
And toxic sites were frequently cited in a lot of these red-lined areas.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Great. So Gary, I want to turn to you now, because I think that a lot of times when we think about environmental justice, we tend to think about the neighborhoods or regions that we live in. So how sea level rise is affecting Chelsea and East Boston, or how air pollution from a nearby coal plant might affect the people who live near there. But we don't always think about the specific house that we live in. And you and I have talked before this, you talked about the need to move environmental justice indoors. I think that's a great phrase. So what do you mean by that? And in what way does housing affect our health?
Yeah, so actually, a lot of when I think about housing and environmental justice, the story really starts with a lot of the things that Kiana just brought up, right? The why behind where we live and where different populations live. So the history of segregation, redlining, is the start of that story, the institutional racism of that. You mentioned sort of the outdoor sources. The EJ movement definitely is mostly rooted in focusing on outdoor pollution sources. Is a certain neighborhood closer to industrial sites or closer to high level of traffic? And that's because there was institutional racism in the siting of facilities, siting of waste disposal, land use planning. The same racism that led to the segregation and redlining has driven all these siting processes. But that's not the only story. As you said, I do work that looks at how housing affects your health, and there is an environmental justice story that happens indoors. If you think about the environment as any place you spend time, there is likely an environmental justice story there. So the environment is indoors, outdoors, your workplace. There's a broad definition. If you think about in the course of a lifetime, 9 of the 10 breaths you take in occur indoors. And those environments are shaped by a lot of other factors that you can say have their roots in institutional racism or just environmental injustice. In terms of how your home can affect your health, there are a lot of different factors. It can be from overcrowding, pest problems, mold and moisture, excessive heat, chemical exposures, secondhand smoke. These aren't experienced equally by all people, and the reasons for these disparities touch on justice issues as well. Probably the most relevant example for most people to see in the last few months has been the COVID crisis. So it's a different environmental story, but it's highlighted some of the risks that happen at home and at work. There are drivers there that we can understand. There have been studies done by colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health have shown that mortality rates for COVID were highest in communities with higher poverty, communities with higher household crowding, communities with a higher percentage of populations of color, communities that had more segregation. When the mortality rate in Massachusetts started to rise in April, it was 40% higher in cities and towns with the largest concentrations of people of color compared to the least. So, think about all the places you spend time and think about all of the ways you're exposed to those, to environmental risks, whether it's the air you're breathing indoors and outdoors, the water you're drinking, the soil your kids are playing on. Unfortunately, there are environmental justice narratives for almost all aspects of those exposures. And that's what we've tried to highlight in some of the work we've done.
Great. I'd love for you to talk for a moment too about public housing and how public housing can actually perpetuate a lot of environmental injustices.
Yeah, well, the thing that we've spent a lot of time actually looking at, trying to look at exposures within public housing. We've worked closely with the Boston Housing Authority. both on the good and the bad. They've been a great partner, actually, in trying to identify some of the problems with environmental exposures in their housing. And they've also been part of the solution. Boston Housing Authority has redeveloped properties to address some of these issues. But those issues that I mentioned, pest infestation, which can go hand in hand with pesticide exposure, mold problems, anytime you have deferred maintenance of housing, you can have serious environmental problems. And public housing in this country has been historically underfunded. So Boston Housing Authority is not alone in kind of wrestling with those issues. I should say it's important to point out, even though we've spent a lot of time looking at the problems within public housing, there's nothing worse for your health than not having a home at all. So, you know, if you think about this on the spectrum from homelessness to housing, having housing and secure and affordable housing is step one. That doesn't mean there aren't lots of issues to address in public housing. And if you look around the country, I think the number for the New York City Housing Authority is that they have something like $40 billion in capital needs. That's basically decades of neglect in terms of the funding needed to support those families. And what you end up with is housing that has a lot of problems, and it takes a lot of money to fix that. And Boston Housing Authority has wrestled with some of those same issues.
Great. So Eduardo, I want to come to you now, and in shifting topics a little bit, but quite related, talking about to use Gary's term, bringing environmental justice indoors, bringing environmental justice to the workplace. So you mentioned earlier that exposure to different things in your workplace is a pretty stark example of environmental injustice. And we've also seen in this pandemic that where someone works really affects both their chances of getting coronavirus, as well as their ability to either isolate or quarantine if they are exposed. And so my first question to you is, how are environmental justice issues and workplace issues interconnected? And then sort of related to that, in what ways has that all exploded during the pandemic?
Well, there are several ways of answering this kind of question. One of them is figure out who works where. And you're gonna see that the jobs that are more hazardous tend to be the jobs that people of color, where people of color work. In a given workplace, let's assume a workplace is a ladder, you're gonna see that the people of color are always in the bottom of that ladder. Hardly ever they're on the top, hardly ever they're the supervisor, hardly ever they're the people who are actually have more power in the workplace. So that creates a situation where those who tell you what to do tend to be not people of color, and that creates a very significant dynamic of some people tell you what to do and you have to obey because the workplace does not really provide an opportunity for people to have a whole lot of debate about what to do. Some people tell you what to do and some people just do what you're told. And this pandemic clearly showed that the people who told you what to do didn't really take care of you, especially if you were an immigrant, especially if you were Latino, but not only, African Americans the same way, people call it in general. It's not a coincidence that the workplace became another place where a lot of COVID happened. A lot of COVID got spread in workplaces because they were not giving protective equipment. They were not given conditions to work with social distance or physical distance, as I like to say. And the other issues that beyond what was just said, not only workers are exposed to more hazardous substance in these jobs, I would like to address something that was not mentioned before. When you talk about toxic waste sites where people working or communities are dumped at, we never really asked about how about the workers? The workers are the ones who are exposed to this on a daily basis in the factories, in the places that actually produce the hazardous waste. So those workers were also the ones who were told, go there and clean up these sites. So the folks in the community got dumped at, they tend to be people of color. The people who also clean the sites tend to be also people of color. In many cases, that's what you see, although in many cases they were not given the jobs to do the cleanup. but in the places that produce the hazards, produce the chemicals, produce the pollution, the workers were there. And I'm talking about miners, I'm talking about people who work in factories. In the time we had factories, now we are mostly talking about service sector jobs. And you go in any restaurant in Boston, you go in any place, you have residential construction. The folks who deliver a lot of the stuff you want at home for Amazon, for all the other delivery sites, they tend to be people of color. And they couldn't stay home, they couldn't work home. They were exposed constantly, not only at work, but also they brought the virus home and vice versa. So we now know that the workplace was a major site, and we see this in meat packing plants, for example, where workers could not distance themselves within the plants. And the people who we typically don't talk much about, especially in Massachusetts, but in other parts of the country, they are very important, are agriculture workers. Agriculture workers are the ones who put food on your table, and they could not stop working. And they were heavily exposed to all kinds of products, from pesticides to not having rights to do the minimum hygiene that you would expect any worker to do. Plus, a lot of these workers are working overtime, which is another issue that contributes to more and more hazards. So, and to end, the aspect that I would like to raise is the so-called psychosocial hazards. Sexual harassment in the workplace for immigrants and people of color, more prevalent than whites. The issue of humiliation, the issue of bullying. Typically, those are the workers who are bullied. So not only the physical, the chemical, the biological hazards that we just mentioned, but also the psychosocial. What happens is there is environmental injustice also in who is recognized in the workplace, who gets credit for the job that's well done. And typically what you see is people of color are the ones who do the day-to-day job in hospitals, in nursing homes, in restaurants, in any number of places, and they do not get the recognition. They are not the ones that we tend to believe are the ones who actually created the wealth that we see every day. So there's an economic component. They make lower salaries, they have less power, they're exposed to more hazards, and they also suffer psychologically and emotionally because of the so-called oppression and unjust distribution of power within the workplace.
Yeah, I think one of the things that all three of you have really touched on is this idea that when we think about the term the environment, we tend to think water pollution and rivers and streams and trees, but the environment is anywhere you are. And so environmental justice is about bringing justice to all sorts of different spaces. And so Mark, I want to zoom in on Massachusetts for a minute, because I think that most people in this audience are from Massachusetts. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of environmental justice policy in this state?
Well, the concept has been around for about, I don't know, something over a decade. Deval Patrick talked about it. And the concept, as it's being framed in law, in proposed laws, is that there are parts of the state which bear a disproportionate environmental burden already, and that that when you look at those areas, they have to be treated differently from the state as a whole. Everybody talks about Chelsea, I will too, but when take Chelsea and Wellesley, just as sort of polar opposites in terms of this matter. Wellesley is has widely dispersed houses, mostly single family. It has a lot of trees. It does have some highways running through it, but if you measure the outdoor air quality in Wellesley, most days it's going to be pretty good. You do the same thing in Chelsea. Chelsea has a couple of highways running through it and one over it. It's the storage place for the entire state's supply of road salt. It is within spitting distance of the airport and therefore gets the benzene exhaust from the jets. It has some industrial sites. It is bounded by waterways which have been used to bring oil into Massachusetts for about 170 years. And if you take the air quality on Chelsea on a good day any one of the doctors that we associate with would say, don't breathe that stuff ever. And people are breathing it 24/7 when they live in Chelsea. So the legal concept is to take places like Chelsea, which bear already an inordinate burden of environmental pollution, and treat them separately from the way you treat other things. And the way it comes up is when somebody wants to cite a new facility, you want to have, and there's now current legislation which is going this direction, to say that facility has to be looked at in the context of the place where it's being put, not as if it were being put in an open field somewhere where its pollution could be dispersed. So that's the legal concept. Right now, that has very little structure in Massachusetts law right now. There are bills that would give a definition that are pending.
Great, and I'm going to ask you to actually talk about those bills for a moment, but could you, I think an important part of the environmental justice movement in this state too has been that not only do we need to say in how projects are both cited and decided upon. Is that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think has evolved in this concept is the idea that the people who face these hazards every day have expertise that has to be paid attention to. And that a lot, when we started working on these issues, you would get the chemists and you get the, get EPA people in with their little sniffers and you'd look for things. And partway through the process, when people worked on these areas, is they discovered that while you do need a chemical sniffer to figure out which chemicals are in the air, the people who live there, the people who are developing asthma and nosebleeds and cancer, are pretty good judges of whether the air is breathable. In fact, they're better. It turns out the human nose is a lot more sensitive than most of these mechanical sniffers. And if the people, so if you empower the people in the neighborhoods that are being affected by this, you will have the best monitoring and the best feedback as to whether your plans are working that you can get. We've tried to, people who are advocating for this have tried to write that concept, that the victims are experts, into the law and give them the power to speak and the power to stop processes that would add to their burdens. And that's, that's sort of the essence of what we're trying to do on environmental justice legislation.
Great. And just briefly, maybe you can touch upon the environmental justice amendment that was attached. Where does environmental justice law stand right now in the State House?
There's the legislature, the House and Senate have passed two different energy bills that sort of the headline on the energy bill in both cases is that we would move from our current level of greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. So if you look at the bills, that's the way they're filed. The House version of that bill has a fairly lengthy multi-page section on environmental justice, which defines environmental justice communities in terms of who's there and what kind of environmental loading is there, empowers those communities to intervene if new environmental hazards are going to be put into their neighborhoods, and requires special permitting for facilities that might be built in those areas to be done. That bill is now, the House version of the bill and the Senate version are in a conference committee in the legislature, which if they come to agreement before they adjourn finally in January, would go to the governor's desk, and we have every reason to think he would sign it, although he hasn't promised to. Anyway, so that's where the bill is. It's, I think of the bill that we've got as sort of setting up the framework for looking at environmental justice issues with some power. Right? It doesn't solve the problems, but it sets up the framework. It says these are environmental justice communities. These are neighborhoods that are particularly affected. The people in these communities are going to have this kind of power to affect decisions that are made about their environment, and they're going to have access to the information on what they need on how they need to decide things. Then you have to do it. But right now, we're not even, we're not there. We've got a pretty good step towards it if we can get this bill out of committee and signed.
Great. So Kiana, I want to move back to you for a moment. And as a law professor, I wonder if you can talk about the significance of codifying something like environmental justice into law. And what do we know about whether it works?
You have me laughing like Mark. So it's funny, I have this discussion often with my students on, it's like a starting point, it's like a framework, the law. But I also think the law, I always tell people, you know, if you go into any society and you don't know what their beliefs are, what their values are, you kind of look at their laws and that kind of, they tend to sway sometimes with what the values and people are. It's kind of the same with our laws. By, you know, codifying these laws or creating these laws, it's saying that we value this thing. We value environmental justice. We value climate change. We value what's going on. And it is a framework. Laws can be interpreted, as we know, very different ways, and they do get interpreted very different ways. But it is that starting point saying, you know what, we see the problem, we're addressing the problem, and this is what we need to do. But it just really gives a framework. Everybody else has to go in and fill in all the necessary pieces that to make it actually work. So to Mark's point, will it fix everything? No, but it kind of really provides that base level on us really starting to make a change.
Great. And are there examples of places that have passed environmental justice laws that you think are good models, or, you know, what enforcement mechanisms work or don't work?
In the United States? Because I can go out into other countries.
Yeah, maybe other countries that do it better. Go for it.
Yeah, there were several other countries that have made environmental justice or just the environment a forefront. You know what I mean? They have said, you know, hey, it's a human right to have access to clean air, clean water, you know what I mean? It's that. We have not technically said that. We don't, that's not in our Constitution. And as far as, I think your second question was, how do we?
Just enforcement mechanisms.
Enforcement, yeah. It starts, I was gonna say at the top, but it really starts with our government. And I don't mean federal, right? Although we know this is a global issue, it is not just the United States, this is a global issue. But I would say it would really start with the state levels and the majority or the highest people at the state level, the governors really saying, this is our problem here, this is what we're gonna do, kind of with the legislative here. I don't know what's gonna come out with, Mark, but I can guess. But you know, this is what's gonna happen and what should we do. I think that's it starts there, but enforcement, this will take me down a deep hole that I don't want to go to, but we have these separations of powers, right? And so enforcement is weird in this country. We think just because the president says this, that the, you know, Congress says this, that no, there's always checks and balances. Courts are really awesome. They're good mechanisms. But if I'm going to just leave it on the legislation, governors, senators, congressional people, any of the House of Representatives, that's where they can really enforce and really fine people. EPA, if you have noticed, had to tick up their fines because people were doing the cost of business. The cost of business of, you know, breaking the law might have been cheaper than falling with the law. That's a problem. You know what I mean? That's not enforcing. So fines or certain, maybe throwing people in jail may help deal with these things, maybe good enforcement mechanisms.
Great. So Gary, you study housing and have done a lot of work specifically with public housing. I'm curious if there are places that have an environmentally just housing policy. Are there good examples of these places? And if so, what does an environmentally just housing policy look like?
Sure. So I want to hesitate just like Kiana did. There are really no perfect places. There are a lot of good models to admire, though. Before I sort of talk about what there is to admire, I want to emphasize the fact that there's also no single answer. You really need a comprehensive approach, and even though I study, the kinds of things that, are physical exposures, chemicals in the air or mold exposures or chemicals in air or in dust. If you really want a healthy housing policy, then it's economic, it's environmental, it's everything. So if I were to look for a place that had a just housing policy or an environmentally just housing policy, it would include things you wouldn't normally put into the environmental category. So it would be a place that had a concerted effort to curb homelessness. That's a significant risk to your health, a significant, stressor. A commitment to affordable housing. It would be a place where buildings are built to a healthy standard and maintained to stay that way. There would be a way to respond to problems, it's like inspectional services, if having a law on the books doesn't mean anything if there isn't a way to enforce or remedy problems. Homes should be affordable, period. Once again, easier said than done. I realize that. There would also be protections for families who are who are housing insecure or facing eviction, just like the eviction moratorium that's been in place in Massachusetts since April, which is about to expire in 2 days. That's an important element of what is healthy housing and a healthy housing policy. In terms of the details, there are places to admire. The Seattle Housing Authority has built housing specifically designed to be healthy for children with asthma. You can do that. In a lot of cases, the Boston Housing Authority has also redeveloped properties to be green and healthy. You can do both things. You can make a home that is affordable, healthy for its occupants, especially children with asthma, and energy efficient. So you can address climate change and a public health crisis at the same time. Is it easy? No, but there are lots of good models out there. So there are ways of getting at these issues, in places where, places that embrace a green standard. In many ways, green standards are healthy. They really didn't have their origin in people being concerned about health. It was more about resources and energy savings. But green building standards today incorporate many elements of healthy housing. There can be tax incentives for building green and thus building healthy. And you can still do it within the context of affordable housing. So housing authorities aren't the only people doing really good work in this space. A lot of community development corporations, the CDCs that are out there are doing great work, but it can be done. And the thing is, when people will sometimes talk about the cost of doing these things without taking account for the cost of not. When the BHA redeveloped properties and we saw that some asthma outcomes were reduced by more than 50%, the sound of success there was silence. There was no ambulance pulling up to those sites to take a child to the hospital. And we don't see the costs of some of this neglect of housing, but it's in the healthcare that those families need. It's in the energy bills that old dilapidated housing yields. So once again, there's no city in the US I would cite as doing everything right, but there are a lot of individual actors and a lot of grassroots organizations really doing the right thing holistically on housing policy, but specifically on how do you build and maintain what I would call healthy housing.
Yeah, I think you just brought up two really, really important points that are so central to environmental justice. One is thinking about the cost of doing something versus the cost of not doing something. And then the other is that a lot of times actions we take can have co-benefits that we didn't necessarily expect or plan for. So whether that's a more energy efficient building might also be better for a child with asthma, that these things are really important. So I'm going to ask one or two more questions, but I just want to remind everyone in the audience that you can ask questions. We've got one in so far, but please use the Q&A function, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can add to the chat there. We have people standing by to relay those to me, so I look forward to your questions. But kind of related to what Gary had just said, Eduardo, I want to turn to you because I think we'd be really remiss in a discussion about environmental justice to not talk about what people mean by a just transition. So what do we mean by a just transition, and what are some concrete examples of that?
So just transition is the idea that if we want to clean the environment, we have to stop producing substances that pollute the environment. And some sectors of our economy will have to be transitioned to something else. All the industry that rely on fossil fuel, for example, or the mining industry. You can't go to the workers and say, I'm going to shut down your workplace, because you're never going to have support from workers who are going to lose their jobs. So we have to have something that proposes a change that would support people while there's a transition in the economy. For this to be just, you need to actually support the workers who are going to lose their job. As we created the super fund to clean the environment, we should also create a super fund for workers. The super fund was a fund that was created, paid by the industry, so that we could have some funds to clean the pollution that they created. The same has to apply for workplaces. And in order to be just in the aspects we're talking about for environmental justice, you have to make people of color whole in that transition, because many of the jobs that are highly dangerous are jobs occupied by people of color. So what that means is, as we did with the GI Bill, we have to fund people to get new skills. We have to fund them to go to college if that is the case. We have to fund training, and we have to support them so that they get the new jobs. So if we're going to an economy that is less, I wouldn't say totally clean, but cleaner, and we're going to create jobs that actually will be helpful for the environments in general, we have to invest in the workforce that will be working. So in these jobs, so if we're talking about electric cars, if we're talking about wind turbines, we need to have people to do these jobs. Solar panels, who are going to do these jobs? Are these jobs going to be safe, healthy, or not? Because we don't want to replace a bad job for another bad job. Even if some aspect of that job will be better for the environment, it may not be better for the workers. So in order to be a just transition, you have to take into account what will be the jobs in the future that will allow workers and communities to have safe and clean environments as well as workplaces. And that means investment, as we already did in the past, for this kind of transition.
Great. And Mark, you're sort of my energy expert guy on this panel here. So I want to pose the same question to you. What do you think people mean by a just transition, and what are a couple things that, how might that look? Just one or two examples.
I mean, I think Eduardo described it clearly. The transition part is that we're going to move from a polluting and global warming environment to one that is less polluting and not warming the globe. And that means that the industries that produce the pollution or that produce the fossil fuel energy that we use that's causing global warming are going to have to change. They're going to have to stop doing that. And the people or the companies or both who have been doing that are going to have to do something else. And when we made the transition from an economy that was run primarily by human labor and animal labor and a little bit of water power, which is where we were before the Industrial Revolution, to the one we have now, which runs on fossil fuel and pollution, the transition was not just. The people who had been involved in the old economy were left to their own. People starved, people that had to leave their homes and move to other places, and so on. This is something we're going to have to make happen. And the idea that we would consciously go to those workers who are going to be displaced by the transition and make it possible, for the people who are nearing the end of their work life, to give them the money to tide them over to retirement, for the people who are going to continue to work, to train them for the new jobs that we're going to need for the new economy, is, the essence of a just transition. They didn't cause this problem, right? They are victims of the solution that we need to do, and we have to take care of them.
Yeah, I think another thing too, when I talk to people about what a just transition might look like, something that comes up a lot is access to these solutions. So in addition to the people who are going to be making these things that we're going to need, and making sure that it's all equitable, that there's also just issues about access. So making sure that people can afford electric vehicles, or can afford to turn their house from being heated by natural gas to thermal heat, or a heat pump of some sort. But again, I'm gonna pull back here, because I could also go down a long rabbit hole about this. And I want to turn to everyone's questions in the audience. We've got a bunch that have come in that are great. So this first one is that we've heard a lot of great information about how minorities are impacted by pollution and hazardous work environments. Can we talk for a minute about how climate change is creating environmental justice issues? So when we're talking about we're talking about heat waves, droughts, sea level rise. Mark, this might actually be a good question for you to take, if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll do my best. Others can chime in. I mean,
Others can please chime in. Yeah.
The global warming affects everybody, but there are people and areas that get affected more. I mean, it's, in Hurricane Sandy flooded the Hamptons and the Rockaways. But the people from the Hamptons who got flooded went to their other house. The people from the Rockaways didn't have another house to go to. If people are familiar with the greater geography of Long Island, you know what I'm talking about. But it's, I mean, that's a literal example of, it's the same flood. It was the same flood, happened the same day. But if you're hitting multi-million-dollar mansions, those people are in danger when it's flooded, but, their helicopter can come and pick them up, and they can go to their other house. If you're in a duplex in the Rockaways, which you're renting part of, and that gets flooded, you're homeless. It's a really different effect. So again, the climate change hits us all, but it doesn't hit us all the same way. The hottest places on Earth, there are two. There's Death Valley, which recorded 130 degrees recently, which doesn't affect that many people directly because nobody lives there. The second hottest place was around Baghdad, which recorded about 128 degrees. Right? Now, there are a lot of people who live near there, and they're poor. And just for reference point, when you cook a chicken in the oven and it reaches 157 degrees, it's safe to eat. So if you're at 127 degrees air temperature outside your house, that's you're 30 degrees more and you'd be edible. That's a pretty dangerous situation, and that's where we're heading. So,
sure. Within cities, we see disparities about heat exposure. So people who can't afford air conditioning, or people who live in areas that are more developed and have less green spaces, the ambient temperature there is a few degrees warmer than it is elsewhere, and that can really make a difference in people's ability to cool down. And we just know that big heat waves also disproportionately kill people of color and low-income people.
And
Eduardo, yeah, did you want to chime in, and then Kiana?
There are several examples. The one that I would like to emphasize is the one that happened in 1995 in Chicago. We have a heat wave. Over 700 people died. Most of them are African Americans. We have a map showing that African Americans and Latinos died a lot more than whites. People were actually didn't have air conditioning. They lived by themselves, especially the elderly. And part of the reason why they were not helped is because of violence in the area where they live. So they were actually very much not in contact with people. It took sometimes a few days for people to realize that a person had died. Heat waves are happening in several cities in our country. The other issue that is a bookcase for anybody that wants to see this is look at what happened at Katrina. Katrina was a major example on how you suffer more. You don't rebuild the communities of color. You don't rebuild the neighborhoods that they call them wards in New Orleans. And since then, hurricane after hurricane, the people who suffer the most tend to be those who live in low-lying areas that are flooded more than others. And when the recovery happens, those people are not made whole. They never are able to recover. The small businesses are never able to recover. So they suffer before, they were worse off before, during the storm, and after the storm.
Yeah, and I think, Kiana, before I come to you, I just want to point out one other population that we haven't really talked about much tonight, but that is also disproportionately impacted by climate change, by heat waves, by a lot of these things, and that's the elderly. So older adults are hit hard by a lot of these things and will continue to face a world that's just going to be more and more inhospitable. But Kiana, go ahead.
You know, I'll be quick. I think everybody's saying it, but I guess really to answer the question on taking it on a high level, you said it, Miriam, the kind of the first exchange with you and Mark is really access. And it's access. Certain people have access to resources to help them relieve the impacts of climate change. Climate change, like Mark said, affects us all. But a UN report has reported out, because this is globally, a UN report reported out that it's going to affect the poor much harder than it will affect the rest of us. And I think that is really what it is if you don't have access to cope or deal with these things, you're going to be hit harder. And unfortunately, that is disproportionately, yes, the elderly, yes, on an economic line, yes, people of color, Native American area. I mean, I can go down the list. So it's really about access on really trying to deal with these issues.
Great. So the next question I want to get to is someone asked, what is one concrete thing you would want grassroots advocates to do beyond just spreading awareness and education campaigns? What's something that people can actually do? Mark, go ahead.
I've got one. I mean, we've got this bill. It's sitting in the conference committee. It would, as we've said, lay the framework for the community aspect of environmental justice. It's not a solution to everything, but it's a step towards a solution. It will either get out of committee with a favorable report and go to the governor's desk this year, or we will get to start over on this issue next January. It would be much better to get it out. What people can do is contact their legislators, in both the Senate and the House, and say, well, if you're on the conference committee, and I can give you the list of who is, please pass this out. And if you're not on the conference committee, why don't you call your friend who is on the conference committee and tell them to put this out? You know, the strongest possible climate bill, including the environmental justice section as written in the House. And that would be really, really helpful.
Sure. Do you want to maybe tell us the name of the bill and
the Senate bill? It's a combination. There are two bills. There's House 4933, which is the House bill that has the climate justice legislation in it. The Senate bill is Senate 2500, which doesn't have the climate justice language, but has a lot better, from my point of view, better language on dealing with climate change itself. It's the best of both that we want out of the committee, and that's right now. They got a few other things to deal with in the State House. They got a budget crisis. They got a police reform bills. A lot of people are saying we should repass an act that protects reproductive rights. That all has to happen too. But this one, isn't urgent in the way some of the other ones are, which means we have to make it urgent if we want it to happen. Climate change and environmental stuff, environmental justice can always be put off. It's easy. Then, some people die, and then you get to put it off again. We have to create the urgency to make it happen. That's one thing.
While we're on the subject of what we can do beyond educating ourselves and advocating, there are a number of advocacy groups locally to Massachusetts who would really benefit from all of our support. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Here we go. So I was going to share this at the end, but I think it makes sense now since we're on the topic. Obviously, 350 Mass, Mark Dian's organization. There's also Grassroots, NOAA, CREW, Roxbury Environmental Empowerment Program, and the Sunrise Movement, which is dedicated specifically for youth. So what I'm going to do actually is email around a resource guide for everyone that has a reading list of articles and books for people who are interested in diving in and learning more. And then I'll also list the legislative bills that are in conference committee right now and these organizations if you're interested in volunteering, donating, etc. I realize we're at 8:30. There's tons of questions left. So I would say that for anyone who wants to stay on and have their questions answered, please do. I also want to be mindful of people's time. So if you need to drop off, you could do that as well. But
yeah, I'd say there's one more really good question on here that I would love for us to get to. And that is, someone asked, how might we take more responsibility for the environmental burdens we all create from consumption? So whether that's food or consumer products or the houses that we live in, how can we do that without shifting these burdens to environmental justice communities? And whether those are in EJ communities down the street locally or internationally, what are some concrete things we can do?
I would say the solution to this problem is not to spread pollution fairly. We have to create a new economy that's cleaner, which means you have to put pressure on the polluters, those who produce stuff that we shouldn't be consuming, to stop doing that. Removing chemicals that are carcinogens that cause cancer from the economy. Removing pesticides from agriculture. That means it's a collective action we need to take, but not focus on people individually. Focus on those who produce the products that we are consuming, because that is how we're gonna get a lot more people not to consume what they shouldn't be consuming. Plastics, for example. A lot of our economy is an economy that was based on fossil fuels, so we have to change it, not only by not consuming, but also putting pressure on the producers to stop producing this.
That's a great answer. Mark, I saw you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, Kiana, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to add one more thing because Eduardo, that was really perfect and I wasn't going to add. But there's one thing we hadn't talked about that I think the question also alluded to is the products and stuff that we use, right? And one, being aware to it. The United States, other countries have banned certain products that we allow, and I mean we government policy, we allow in our products that are harming us. And Mark even said that are dealing with the reproductive of women, and again, disproportionately women of color. So I think, to Eduardo's point, is calling them out, really putting pressure on these companies that are using these chemicals and say, we're not going to allow it, because guess what? We buy these products. We can stop buying them. We can boycott them. And I think putting that pressure would be good as well.
I mean, I strongly agree with the idea that that's basically, the heart of the matter is policy, not individual activity. But I mean, it just is. People come up to me and say, well, if I stop using plastic bags, will that help? And the real answer is, yeah, but not much, right? Right. Stopping them from producing plastic bags, on the other hand, would help a lot. But I'll suggest 3 things that a person can do, because there are a couple of purchases that you make in your life that really affect things. The vehicle. that you drive to work if you purchase a vehicle. You want the highest mileage or a better electric vehicle right now. You know, they're more expensive. I'm not saying everyone can afford this. We've got programs to deal with that. But right now, if you can buy an electric vehicle, do so. If you're getting a new house, again, this is an access question, having one that that is all electric is a big deal. It's safer for you, right? You can't have a healthy house with a gas stove in it if you use the stove. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. It's a combustion appliance, which the combustion exhaust is going into your kitchen, right? And that's, you know, I've never been in a program where we measured carbon monoxide from ovens that it didn't fail. So, you know, that's number two, big purchase. And then the third is if you can buy, and a lot of towns can, buy either 100% renewable or largely renewable electricity, do that. All of these is what I was saying, yeah, it costs too much. You're right. I'm just saying, you know, in answer to the question, we have to change policy. If you've got the money to make these choices now, make them, and back us when we try to make sure that everybody can afford to do this. And that way, you back the fossil fuels out of the system. That doesn't deal with pollution questions, right? And people have said, call them out on it, identify, there are polluting products and there are less polluting products available. That's, again, I think it's fundamentally policy that matters. And the individuals should do what they can. But you know, we have to replace all the cars. We have to replace all the furnaces. You have to replace all of the fossil fuel power plants, not just the one you use.
I think that's
policy.
I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And I really am so grateful for all of you for being on this panel and for all of you who have attended this panel. I apologize that we did not get to all of the questions, but I know Amy has an amazing list of resources that she's going to send out. And even just in the course of this panel, I thought of 2 or 3 more things that we can add to the list. So Amy, I'll send you an email. But everyone else, thank you so much. And I really hope you took something from this and that it changes the way that you see the world around you and maybe helps you make decisions about how you want to live your life and treat the community around you. So Amy, did you want to say anything else?
I believe I turned everyone's chat on. If you wanted to say a thank you to the moderator and panelists for being here, I'm sure they would appreciate it. I know it's very one-sided with the webinar format, but thank you all for being here, panelists and attendees. This was, you know, really informative for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people here. Again, I will be in touch via email with some calls to actions for you all. And enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you.